Find us online at kciw.org.
Hello, KCIW listeners, and welcome to Curry Cafe, where we put together a panel of volunteers and guests who discuss various topics from whimsical and fun to more serious subjects.
You know, Rick, that's the first time I think I listened to your intro, and I realized that that's almost exactly what I say as the intro, so I won't say it this time.
Okay.
We do have a panel of interesting guests here, and we will be talking about an interesting subject today. So let's just start out by going around the table and have everybody introduce themselves, why they think they should be here, or whatever they want to do. It's pretty informal.
I'm Robert O'Sullivan. I have been involved in politics and other things all of my life virtually, and I'm happy to be here.
And I am Rick McNamer, volunteer here at KCIW, and found out on my extensive research that I'm part of the 60% of the Americans who've never really read through the Constitution, but I've been cramming and hopefully learned something today.
And my name is Kevin Hendrick. I live in Crescent City, California, and I've been writing a column for the Delaware Triplicate. I wrote a column about the Constitution, which Rick read and then assumed I knew something, and we'll see. He invited me to come up.
Before we go any further, I forgot to mention that everybody here is expressing their own opinions or opinions of researchers that they may have researched. And should you want to join in the conversation with some of your ideas, you can text us. Now, everybody get ready to write this down. 541-661-4098. 541-661-4098. Operators are standing by to receive your texts and let us know what you think about what we're saying. So, who wants to start out today?
How about appointing Mr. Robert O'Sullivan,
Okay.
the main expert, if that's okay, Robert?
Okay, I'm happy to. There are some things that are quite basic that most Americans don't have any idea of. And at the heart of it is the United States has never been a democracy, never even been close. When the Constitution of the United States was adopted, the only people who were really involved in any voting were white male property owners. Women were excluded, Native Americans were excluded, African Americans, whether free, and there were some that were free or enslaved, were not included. It was strictly a way of organizing things that was done by white males who were much richer than virtually anyone else.
Could I just get a definition on that property owners? Does this mean many acres, or if you had...
I believe it varied from state to state and even area to area, but in most cases it had to do with substantial ownership of property, including possibly slaves, which were considered property. And most of the people involved in the adoption of the Declaration of Independence and of the Constitution were themselves slave owners. And what is more far away from an idea of democracy than slavery? So from the beginning, this has never been a democracy, and there were things that were put together in the Constitution which pretty much prevented ever being close to being a true democracy. And that true democracy idea I'm talking about has the assumption that everybody's vote counts the same. Well, the votes of people in Montana and Wyoming, their votes count a lot more than the people in California or Florida or New York, because they have two people in the U.S. Senate, whether they have millions and millions of their population or far less. And anyway, there are other ways to get around, or there are other things to talk about what a true democracy is. But what makes it really difficult is it's so hard to change the Constitution. And there are two ways. One involves both houses of Congress and then the states, and another is by calling a constitutional convention, and that's extremely difficult to do. So anyway, those who assume that this is a democracy and that the Constitution is truly a democratic document has some learning to do.
Before we, I know this isn't the Constitution, but I always think of this when I think of the slavery. But when Thomas Jefferson wrote the sentence that when he penned the sentence that all
men are created.
Yeah, it's self-evident that all men are created equal. He was probably handed that pen by a slave.
Could well have been.
Yeah.
And he had many slaves of his own. They stayed in the family after he died. He also had a sort of slave mistress.
If you've ever been to Monticello, they will take you through the slave quarters, and they'll show you the fields where they worked and how had all the underground stuff that the slaves traveled around the house, and so they wouldn't be out there in the sight of everybody. There was a dumbwaiter that brought the food up to the dining room when there were people visiting, and I can remember in school
I think
the teacher saying, George Washington had slaves, but he treated them very well.
And how do we know that, really?
Well, we didn't, but when you're in second grade, teachers
Sure.
are not teaching you bad stuff about whatever.
I
Right.
heard that Jefferson invented the dumbwaiter, but Trump has perfected it.
So
Okay, wait a minute. We may have
hold on.
already dug up some controversy. So if
Okay.
you want to participate by text, it's 541-661-4098. Operators are standing by.
Okay. So the high reverence that the Constitution and the Founding Fathers and all of that, I mean, I think there was partly a reason for that. There was a big, sometimes heroic thing that they did, a lot of fancy words. And it's hard reading that Constitution. Again, this is the first time I've really tried. So it's almost in lawyer speak, but I guess they were bright people. But right away, we the people, it doesn't really mean all people.
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of a negative right off the top.
And there was even the making black Americans as 3/5 of a person in the way numbers were counted.
Mm-hmm.
I think in doing the research that I did for my column, which I described the Constitution as a living document, I think the value of it is that it can be amended and has been amended. So many of the things that you've described were true, of course, when it all started. But in the aftermath of the Civil War, the amendments 13 through 15 started redressing some of the inequities of freeing the slaves, for example, giving them the right to vote and setting some standards. And in looking through the amendments and the time frames that the changes happened, they were in response to actions of the people. In many cases, the change doesn't happen in Washington. The white guys sitting there are not going to fix the problems without other people pointing it out. And so one thing I noticed is after Prohibition was adopted, which was a movement that was, I think, predominantly organized by women, that in the short aftermath after Prohibition, the women got the right to vote. That happened because of that advocacy. And I noticed that in 72, when the amendment was adopted that allowed 18-year-olds to vote, which was a big thing at the time, and that was right before I turned 18, that was in the aftermath of the advocacy around the Vietnam War, where the youth got organized, and then response happened. Change happened as a result of that. And so it continues to be potential to change it, but there hasn't been an amendment since 1992, although the Equal Rights Amendment has been in process for a long time.
Whether it's still alive is questionable.
And it's, I think, evidence that it's just harder and harder to get those votes that you need, the 2/3 of both houses, for example, and ultimately 3/4 of the states voting for an amendment is a heavy lift. But one thing that impressed me is the first 10 amendments are the bill called the Bill of Rights.
Right.
The first one, I think, is, I don't know if I should say it's one of my favorites.
Okay.
But
It's the most important
But I think so.
by far.
Freedom of speech and the press, and the right of people to peaceably assemble to
And freedom of religion.
petition for the redress of grievances.
and
I
practice.
mean, as an activist, that's a right that I cherish, that we're able to show up at government meetings and peacefully go out and protest, and because those are the things ultimately that will change. They will help change things when the people decide what they want in an ideal society, and I think that's still possible to
How do we
make
define peacefully?
Well, there again, it's a lot of open to interpretation throughout the document.
Yeah, that is one of the challenges. There are so few words, and the problem now is we have a Supreme Court that is interpreting not only the amendments and what the amendments mean, but going back to I had read the amendments before, but I hadn't read the Constitution body of itself, where the articles, the first
Separation of powers and all that. Yep.
Well, the Articles 1 defines the legislative powers, 2 is executive powers, 3 is judicial powers, and that's the balance of government that's supposed to help things work. But the recent court decision on bump stocks reminded me that that's not about the Second Amendment. Their decision was based on administrative interpretation of a 1930 law. And interesting again, the ban on machine guns was adopted in the middle of Prohibition when the mobs were gunning people down with machine guns. And so they decided, well, maybe machine guns are not so good. And Clarence Thomas, in his judgment, decided that bump stocks are not machine guns, even though they can shoot off 100 rounds a minute. And that was not a decision on the amendment. It was a decision on the administrative ability to interpret legislation. And that is a very, very slippery slope.
So what they were saying is that the
He was basically
Bureau of
saying
Firearms
they're
did not have the right to and in fact that has to be
that
done
they
by
interpreted it wrong, that bump stocks are not machine guns.
Okay.
Even though, and I think it was one of the other justices on the right side of this said, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. But that I think, and there's another case that's coming up, which is Chevron versus NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, that established a rule that the court should defer to administrative interpretation of rules.
By experts, by the government itself.
Right.
Yes.
Right, exactly. So if that starts getting diluted, it's called the Chevron document, and it's a legal principle that courts should defer to the reasonable agency interpretation of ambiguous provisions in congressional statutes, which is how government works. The legislation passes a law. They can't cover all the details.
Regs do.
They can't. Yeah, the regs do it. And Matt, if that gets challenged, then the EPA will not be able to adopt rules to implement laws. And if the courts keep shooting things down.
Yeah.
I'd just like to add one little thing to anybody who's not familiar with a bump stock. Go on YouTube, and there are some wonderful videos there of people blowing up cactus in the desert and whatnot with 100-round magazines, by the way. The guy who did the shooting in Las Vegas had 12 with 100-round magazines.
Right.
Just happened to have the money to afford.
And how many people did he kill? 60?
A bunch.
Too many.
Not only killed a bunch, but wounded a bunch. And I always like this, when people see the word wounded, it's be like Hoppy used to get a flesh wound, and in the next scene, he was fine again. No, you can be permanently crippled, brain damage, all sorts of things. Not to mention the trauma those people went through that weren't.
Well, and it's, I think, worth noting that rule was adopted in 2006 2017 under President Trump, under his administration.
And it took forever. It took weeks and weeks and weeks.
Maybe a year
Yeah.
before it happened.
On
now
my
the
show,
courts-
every week I would do a countdown. It's been 9 weeks since the
Yeah.
Congress hasn't done anything.
So my point is the Supreme Court is now creating an imbalance in that three parts of the government where, our legislature is deadlocked, doesn't seem to be able to function right now. And the Supreme Court is making interpretations of our rights that are diverging from what I think is correct.
The Supreme Court, that there are at least 3 members of which who lied to get on the Supreme Court, quite obviously.
Right.
I'd like to get back to the question of the Constitution itself. When the Constitution was originally passed, there were some things that were left undecided. And a lot of people, for various reasons, wanted them to be decided. And they were done, must have been 3-4 years later. And the Bill of Rights was the first 10 amendments. But one of the facts of American history is often, even though they're clear as to what they say Congress and later by the post-Civil War amendments, all government agencies cannot do, things kept happening that involved governments doing exactly what they were forbidden to do. And this happened after the original amendments were passed on free speech. There was a Aliens and Sedition Act. This is back in 1798. And after World War I, there was a similar type act. And these were upheld in the courts. And even though they counter what is strictly forbidden by the Bill of Rights, which is part of the Constitution, it's been a problem altogether. In preparing for this program, I looked at some writings by Howard Zinn, who has written a book that's very wonderful called The People's History of the United States, when he gets into issues that most history books don't get into. But he told the story about how on, let's see if I have the page turned to the correct place, how even when the language is clear, it's often just ignored. And it turns out that during World War II, there was a movie producer who produced a movie about the American Revolution called The Spirit of 76. And this correctly, as most people knew, pointed out that it was war between the British and the colonists, the Americans. And anyway, he wound up being prosecuted and jailed under this American Sedition Act because the British were our allies, and this film was countering our relationship with Great Britain. And according to what Zinn said, well, let me read it exactly. The name of the movie was The Spirit of 76, and the title of the court case against the filmmaker was U.S. versus the Spirit of 76. And the case sums up the relationship of the government to the Bill of Rights, U.S. versus the Spirit of 76. It was the President of the United States who, Truman, all of these things are forbidden, and yet they've survived and continue to survive.
So rather way outdated then.
Or
am I reading that wrong?
They're clear, but the courts always has a way of ignoring the clear thoughts.
Okay. And
So was that this edition, was that supposedly for the greater good? Is that the reason?
This happened in England when the American Revolution was going on.
Mm-hmm.
People like William Blake were literally jailed under a Sedition Act there. And there, of course, the monarchy was a factor, and that anybody who said anything against the king could be considered seditious. And the French Revolution was going on, and they were afraid that that same revolution would happen in Britain at the time.
And Hitler did the same thing as well during World War II. He couldn't say anything against the war, or he'd have a bunk in Dachau.
And
Let me just
go ahead, Ray.
get the phone number in here again one more time.
Okay.
So if you want to take part in this or make a comment, it's 541-661-4098. 541-661-4098. Operators are standing by.
And back to the Supreme Court, current Supreme Court. I did see a program over the weekend, and the gentleman was talking about how at least 4 of them, I think, would be considered strict, originalist, I suppose.
Yes.
In other words, they still want to read the Constitution as it was in the 1700s or 1800s.
As put together by the rich white men with property.
Exactly. So that's a problem. And is this? We talked about this a little earlier before the show, but is the Supreme Court, are they too powerful these days?
Enormously so.
And it's, again, hard to change. Me personally, I think it's time to increase the number of the judges if we could. And it would be nice to get rid of the Electoral College, like you were saying. I have to quote Bill Maher here real quick. I'm sorry, but he said this one time. He said, let me think how this went. How could you have a state like Maine, whose population is a lobster, a bear, and Stephen King, have the same amount? But I thought it went perfectly. So there's a reason. It's getting kind of out of hand, I think, with... it's just not in balance.
It can be abused like anything else, and that's what it's
Well,
been.
I think it has been.
Yes.
Right.
The Supreme Court still does not have an enforceable ethics code.
Right.
Every other judge in the country, in one way or another, or government employee, has codes of ethics that they have to abide by, but the Supreme Court does not. And look at what Thomas has done and what Alito has done. And to me, the most outrageously corrupt thing of all has to do with the spouse of the Chief Justice Roberts.
Yeah.
She works for a headhunter firm for major law firms. And if you want to get a good lawyer to work in your firm, why not have the wife of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court screen this person and see and get paid well for doing so?
Many years ago, I was a state trooper, and I had a particular interest in juvenile crimes, and I gravitated towards juvenile crimes a lot. And a good friend of mine, who I met through this same thing, was a lawyer. It's a public defender, and he defended juveniles. Well, we had that interest, and we frequently met at seminars and things like that. But we also had the interest of music. He had a degree in music along with his law degree, and I don't have a degree, but I have a great interest in music, especially of the 50s. So one day we happened to meet up where we met up frequently, and accidentally at a concert, happened to be a Bo Diddley concert, outdoor Bo Diddley concert. And while we were waiting for the show to start, we both queued up to get a beer, and I offered to buy him the beer. Oh, I forgot to say that in the intro, he was a judge now. He had just been appointed a judge. And I offered to buy him the beer, and he cited the fact that he was not allowed to take gifts as a judge. Now, I had already been retired, so it wasn't like I was going to have a case in his court coming up anytime soon. But Ray was, I'm sure, interpreting that pretty strictly. But that was
How about
he
a
took
cruise
it.
to Indonesia?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, hey, Ray, how about I buy you a motorhome?
And these same judges you were talking about, they, so far, if I'm right, they have been refusing to recuse themselves
Yes.
Right.
from case. And boy, is that the height of what is the height of
Arrogance.
Thank you.
Uh,
All of that.
I invented a new word for it.
Good.
It's called elitocracy.
Oh, like it. That'll be in the
Ruled
dictionary
by
here soon,
elitos, yeah.
probably. Yeah. Yeah. It's really, I've
And-
been pretty disturbed about
Well, there is an essential arrogance when at least 3 or 4 or 5 members of the court have their own religious beliefs that they somehow feel should be imposed on other people without the right and consent and the democratic processes involved in making law. They're saying that they themselves are above the law by saying that, for example, all the women's bodies in this country are no longer their own, and other things that are really extremist. And but the trouble is, it's very difficult to do anything about getting rid of them. If they could be embarrassed by shame, they appear to be people who know no shame. If they're embarrassed by political talk, they have a lifetime appointment. They're just there. And I hope the court could be increased in number, and that somehow some resignations or impeachments could happen. But it's a sorry insult to democracy to have people with those extremist views imposing them on the whole country.
Agreed.
Has a Supreme Court justice ever been impeached?
There have been some who've retired under an ethical cloud, Abe Fortas back in the 70s or so. I don't think actually impeached. No, not that I'm aware of.
And again, back to the amendments and how hard it is, a lifetime appointment shouldn't be, I don't think that should be part of a Supreme Court judge. And I think age limits should be imposed. But again, not impossible, but very hard. I'm getting a scowl from Ray. Okay, I'll go 85. No, I'm just teasing. But anyway, but it's because the amendments are so hard to change. And by the way, I would just want everybody to know you're listening, of course, to KCIW 100.7 FM, all volunteer community radio station. And like Ray had said, if you feel you want to text in, it's 541-661-4098.
Your mention of the age or the lifetime appointment.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly a young person myself, and I don't like people to stereotype us strictly on age, but our government is a gerontocracy. Look at the U.S. Senate.
Right.
Look at the age of the people running for president. And it's...
And they're calling changes in the attitudes or rules, if you call them, of the population woke, who somehow or another has become a terrible thing, you know. And
yeah, they beat that.
Gay rights would just appear like overnight after the riots in New York and some other stuff. And it eventually it became that being gay was like having brown eyes or blue eyes or whatever. And now, for some reason or other, this is back in the society again. We're grooming. Drag shows are grooming young kids. I think.
The swing to what I would call the extreme right, and this is just a guess, but my opinion is I think it started to me when Reagan befriended Jerry Falwell, and the moral majority started, which I don't think they were either moral or a majority. But anyway, ever since then, and religion has become, some people still claim that God is in the Constitution.
Oh, he wrote it. It's such a wonderful document.
Or God inspired.
He had to yeah.
God inspired.
It's officially considered an inspired document by the Mormon Church, for example.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Which, again, I don't believe. I think most people don't believe that, but it's the open to interpretation.
Well,
and vague. I see some vagaries. Is that the right word?
Yeah.
In there. Go ahead, Kevin.
I see we're halfway through the show. You guys are good talkers. So I'm going to try to insert myself where I can. when I'm writing my column, when I'm talking to people, I try to inform people to think about things that are happening now that we should be aware of. And when I look at the First Amendment, which I'll just only read part of, but it says, it's very short. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And I want to touch on that one right now because I think the people that wrote this, no matter who they were, could not have imagined the things that are happening with media monopolies today.
Yeah. Or technology.
Media, specifically, Sinclair Broadcasting operates 185 TV stations, local TV stations, and people trust local news. So this is insidious what they're doing. And in 2018, they forced their anchors to read this statement on the local news, on every station, 185 TV stations, that they said, the sharing of bias and false news has become all too common on social media. And more alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first. Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal biases and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy. How bold of them to say that as if they were predicting what they themselves were going to do and just did this year, where they took a story from the Wall Street Journal, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, which was, and then they used that as their source, and then they wrote a script for all their anchors. Same thing, all their anchors read it on the air, stating more or less that it is reporting in the Wall Street Journal, calling into question the mental fitness of President Joe Biden. This issue should be an election decider. I mean, this is propagandists quoting other propagandists. And I don't know if we have a Sinclair station in this area.
Yes. 26, or no, 10.
So there you go.
10
But then I went deeper. We have, first of all, God bless community radio. Yes. You guys are great for keeping this alive and having an alternative voice, because this is what people need, is to have another voice to be able to hear. Bicoastal Media owns 54 stations, including 2 in Crescent City, Curry Radio here, 54 stations. I don't know that they're doing the same thing as Sinclair Broadcasting, but just being aware that these companies own this many outlets, and they do all swing right. And finally, the Country Media, which owns the Del Norte Triplicate that I write for, and the Curry Coastal
Pilot List.
They have a dozen newspapers in Oregon and California, including Lincoln County, Columbia County, Polk County, Tillamook, Cottage Grove, Cannon Beach, Bandon. They're very similar newspapers. I know that sometimes our Oregon stories get published in the Triplicate and sometimes vice versa. Now, I have to say about at least my interrelationship with Country Media, they specifically invited me to write a column for them, knowing that I was a Democrat, knowing that I was a liberal. And their intent initially was to, what I call a dueling banjos, give and take with another conservative guy. So they had a good intent to do that. What happened in the ensuing years is the guy that was writing the conservative column is now the reporter. So they definitely lean to the right, but they have found it important, and I give them credit for giving me a free voice, because my only condition on writing for them is that you have to print what I give you. And when you start editing my opinions, then we're done.
Forget it. I'd like to mention a couple things. Oh, it looks like there is a text, but...
two texts.
Two texts. Can I respond a bit to just what he said on ownership of local media? Channel 10 in Medford is a CBS outlet, but it's owned by Sinclair. Channel 10 no longer has a newsroom. Channel 26 no longer has a newsroom. And so these are not only involvement of big chains, but they're cutting out news like crazy, and that's really unfortunate. Now, on the local print area, I like to talk about the pilot lists. In the case of Brookings, we had a major story that was a headline, and headlines all over the world even. I know because I've written about it myself and gotten communications from South Africa, and that has to do with St. Tim's and the city of Brookings. Well, the court in Medford ruled decisively, I forget exactly when, but in March 17th. Anyway, it took the owners of the pilot lists 3 weeks to have anything in their paper about what the court decision was. 3 weeks.
Right. They were reluctant, definitely reluctant to do that.
And I had a history of sending in opinion columns, letters to the editor type thing. They always got lost.
I had the same thing.
I call them up and, well, I'm not the person who handles the emails and blah, blah. And,
Right.
So it's a joke. The only decent print ministry around here is the Lost Coast Outpost, or I have trouble getting the name straight. But that's really sad. And media, other media is changing, but I wanted to mention that.
Yeah,
you have a couple.
That's an excellent point. I want to give them a plug too. The Wild Rivers Outpost is an online publication that does an excellent job in covering local news. I have a text here,
Okay.
which I'm not sure I understand. Yeah, I'll read it in that order, but it still doesn't make sense to me. Hopefully, and then you guys get to comment on it. I remember seeing that on TV. It is pure propaganda. I'm remembering that the Supreme Court can legally be expanded to 13 members since there are 13 districts. I don't know about the 13 districts, but do you want to comment on the idea of expanding the Supreme Court?
It can be expanded to any number the Congress agrees to.
I don't understand why expanding it would make any difference. I mean, now we have...
You get 2 or 3 new progressive
but they could just as easily...
go the other way. In other words,
go the same way. Yes.
Well, I think the theory is Biden gets elected, and then he gets to a point.
That takes care of 4 years. That doesn't take care of many years down the road.
Well, I don't know.
There was a time when it had 7 members, I believe, and
Right.
and
I believe
it can be adjusted.
Yeah, it was Roosevelt.
I think there is an argument to be made not about age but term limits. I mean that having a limited term, because the whole idea of having a lifetime appointment is you don't have to fear for being kicked out.
Yeah.
But if you have a fixed term, you know you're solid for that period of time, and you make your best decisions.
and that kind of hurt us.
That way, when things get stacked the way they are right now, in my opinion, it only lasts for a limited period of time, and there's a turnover, there's a churn.
I wonder if term limits could be done strictly by congressional action.
I don't see anything in the Constitution that describes. It's shocking how little it describes about the courts.
Yeah,
I mean, there's a.
It does mention that the Congress has a say on the money spent by the courts and things like that. So there's administrative
a whole
authority
article,
there.
a whole section under the legislative powers.
Yeah.
But I was looking this morning to see if there's any delineation of executive powers. Nope. Or courts. Not really.
Well, again,
I don't know how it all works, but I think that means the legislature can set rules for how to do it. I think that's possible.
Getting back to the news services, I just wonder, when did we get so dumb that we believe some of the things we see on the news?
Well, speak for yourself.
No, the population I'm talking about. How can they sit and watch or listen to InfoWars and actually give that guy some credence? I've seen bumper stickers.
It's just like the Curry pilot. People, the media serves the news people want to see.
Or who's the other guy?
Fox News. Fox News is not very accurate.
No.
In fact, there was a study that showed that people that watch Fox News as the primary news source are less informed than people that don't watch any news.
Fox News paid $750 million almost judgment
Fine.
against them for lying, not for misrepresenting, not for making mistakes, for just out and out lying. All their top people just continued this lie about the voting machines. So when it came to going to court, obviously they couldn't have Hannity and some of these other people that lied try to defend themselves, or they would be perjuring themselves. So they just settled. So it's a pretty obvious to anybody that watches Fox News or heard that settlement, that should realize that maybe Fox News is at times something less than accurate.
What I often recommend to people is whatever your preferred news is, don't rely on one source.
That's
You
true.
know,
That's good. I do
if
that.
you want to have a perspective, you need to have different sources of information.
I have a news
And-
thing in my phone where and the other night I was reading the news, and like every fourth thing was an MSNBC news, and it was ridiculous. I mean, they weren't as bad as Fox News, I don't think, but they were so opinionated that I had to go through and stress my technical knowledge and eliminate that from my queue of news. But not long after
They're
that,
feeding you because they know you want to see it, even though you're denying it. AI is feeding you.
they'll find it some other way.
MSNBC did do it.
But these are the quote legitimate news sources.
Yes.
It is the internet that is the Wild West of news. And when you consider or even think about the fact that both Russia and China are feeding fake news stories into the internet, and then you see the result of that is that, oh, I saw it on the internet, it must be true. That's a foolish thing to say, but you have congressional people that are taking propaganda that came from Russia that shows up on social media, and then they're accepting it to be true, and then they're bringing it to the halls of Congress as if it was a fact. I mean, that is a really, really hard thing to counteract because
And I believe most of them know it. They just know it'll work in their favor for laws and whatever that they want to pass.
About a week after Fox had to pay that judgment for the voting machines, we have a local internet thing. I forget what it's called, with neighbor to neighbor kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
You're supposed to
Next door.
Yeah, next door neighbor. And about a week, or within a few days, there was somebody wrote in, if you want to know what's really going on the border, check with Fox News. This is the people who just paid $750 million for lying. You just won't discourage them, evidently.
No, it doesn't. I do want to jump back a bit, back to the Second Amendment and the interpretation, because and again, it's short also, but the well-regulated militia. Well, back in the 1700s.
Get me started.
Oh, easy now, Ray. Easy. But again, it was written in the late 1700s. So would that come out to today? Are they going to include the Proud Boys and some of these groups up in Idaho?
The rate of fire in those days was about 3 rounds a minute.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, okay, there again, and I underline
If somebody was really good.
right, or to keep and bear arms. Okay, but the arms then, again, yes, muskets. It didn't have the guy that killed 60 people in Vegas in however many minutes. My point is, you could read that and to say, probably the originalists in the Supreme Court say, hey, it's an arm, an AK-47 is an arm. You have the right to do it. And that's where it gets confusing to me.
Well, the originalists don't even pay attention to the mention of the militias there. They've assumed that this means that every human being has a right to bear arms.
Yes.
And without the context of it being presented in the language itself,
right,
as related to militias. Now, historically, there was a lot going on before and after the Revolutionary War about land and the fight between the haves and the have-nots. And often it had to do, and this is not true in most cases, but true in most all cases, was the moneyed people lived near the coast. They had the money and the cities and the land, and the poor people lived beyond that. And doing things like crops that would help create whiskeys. I'm not sure what's all involved, but made for actually a whiskey rebellion in upstate New York. And there were other things of that sort going on. And there were actually militias in standoffs with more official government military things. And anyway, and there were militias that were specifically designed to catch slaves that were runaways. And there was a lot going on there. But the whole originalist idea, which is a result of the type of ideologues that took over the Federalist Society and the Republican Party's judge-making wing, has this idea that you should go back to the original language of the Constitution. Well, often the original language is ignored, is just an excuse to come up with other reasons for doing what they're doing. And it also has the idea that that the world has not changed, and the bump stock as opposed to the musket, and lots of other ways, and knowledge about the female body. And these idiots, excuse the expression, but I can't think of anything that fits better, who think that finding some 17th century English misanthrope's opinion on matters of morality and sexuality, and if they're to get some teeth in it, maybe even some molarity. But excuse the pun, I like to have puns with teeth in them. But anyway, the original. What happened in recent American history, I think around the 1980s, is the Republican Party realized that they were going to always be the minority party, because there just aren't that many white people producing enough members for their country club set. And therefore, they saw that the way to get their opinions enforced on the American people is through the courts. And they designed in a very sophisticated way of courting young attorneys to be members of groups that were really interested in their political views. And they succeeded. Leonard Leo is at the heart of this. And there's one famous photograph that was enhanced somehow after it was made of Leonard Leo, Mr. Clarence Thomas, and his great benefactor, the guy who loves all the Nazi memorabilia, all together. And they were all part of what was a deliberate conspiracy over 30, 40 years to pack the courts, especially the Supreme Court, with people they recruited and own and control. That was a long sentence.
Well,
Yes.
that's okay.
Thought.
So how do we start to counteract that? And they're dug in pretty deep right now, and I don't know about...
Well, that's where expanding the court comes in as a possibility.
Yeah.
And otherwise, unless they soon learn shame... Actually, the thing I said about Alito before and elitocracy, I put that in response to some things in both the Washington Post and the New York Times. And I'm probably going to recycle them, too, with Alito and his wife being so crazy of late. I love the stuff about the flags. And one thing I really want to track down is Mrs. Alito talked about creating a flag that used the imagery of the holy,
Christ's heart.
Christian nationalism was it?
Yeah, well, there's a specific Catholic term, and it's the Sacred Heart of
Sacred
Jesus.
Heart.
And there's a saints or a liturgical day related to that. And I got the impression that it's somehow related to some of the court actions as to whether Roe v. Wade was overturned on that day or not. I'm not sure. I want to track that down. But this conviction that these weirdo justices in strange parts of the Catholic sphere should be controlling everything that is so basic to our liberty is just outrageous. And to attribute that to divine stuff, I, as a person of faith, find really shameful.
And I know this gets, I think every election somebody or people start, this is the most important election we've ever
Well,
had.
this is.
Yeah, but
This one really is.
Might be the
believe
last
this
one.
because if Trump is elected,
Yeah.
and there's a chance, I sure hope it doesn't happen, but this is just going to go even more haywire. There may be more justices.
If he gets to appoint more, sure.
I don't know.
Sure.
I think on the next show we'll probably be talking more about Trump, but
Okay.
and when I said earlier, when did we get so stupid and we believe some of this stuff we see on the news? I mean, I could probably right now sit down and scribble out 2 pages of things that he has said that were ridiculous or absolute, just
And
out and out lies that he's told.
yeah, and even the ones that originally were against the insurrection have all turned around and
Yeah, they were
become
tourists.
just total
They were
sycophants.
just tourists that wanted to get in there when it was closed.
They've got a little out of hand.
Little out of hand.
Yeah, but we've seen them twist and turn to try to. If you ask them the simple, do you believe the election was fraudulent? That type of stuff, and they just refuse to answer that question, even though you know that they know that it wasn't fraudulent. Hope that came out right.
The thing about the insurrection that I was wondering as I was watching it happening,
Right,
yelling at my television,
right.
where the hell's the security? You know, they had like 5 cops standing out in front.
Well,
And I know we're not supposed to do this, or maybe we can legally do it, but don't we have the Proud Boys and groups like that infiltrated? So we know something about what their plans are going to be?
well, apparently who had thought that was really going to happen?
Well,
I mean,
we know,
I sure-
we know
Well,
that they are.
Well, think about who was in charge. The fact that Trump's administration was in charge of those sources of information. They may have known.
Steve Bannon
Maybe
was
they did know, but
crying out clearly, all hell's going to break loose.
And I had mixed feelings because seriously, the president could have called out the National Guard, but I actually had the reverse concern because at that time it just seemed that it might be worse if the military stepped up because that would be the way to start a coup, and that would make me uncomfortable also. And that's something he could have done. Instead, he did nothing, obviously.
All right.
Well, he claims he did. And what's her name said she didn't want them.
Pointed out how
Nancy Pelosi?
No, not Pelosi. He meant to say Pelosi, or he thought it would be Pelosi, but
he blamed Nikki Haley.
Nikki Haley.
yeah,
She was in California, so
I wanted
and Pelosi was not in charge of security anyway.
Before we run out of time, periods of reasons for hope.
Good.
Let
When
me get my paper out here.
because I'm a Democrat, I'm the chair of the Delaware County Democratic Party, and but we have to talk to our Republican brothers and sisters, and some people can. I do use as a litmus test when somebody says they support Trump. My follow-up question is, do you believe that Biden won the election?
Okay.
So if they say yes, then at least we can start having a conversation. But I heard on TV when the Supreme Court made the recent bad decision, there was a quote from Chief Justice Warren Burger, who was appointed by Richard Nixon, who said that this whole support for high-powered weapons is the greatest fraud on the American public ever, because it was driven by the NRA and the lobbying that the NRA and the people that were elected with the support from the NRA. And it gives me hope that there was a time when a Republican could have a reasonable opinion about things. And then they had quotes from George W. Bush, not my favorite. He looks like a genius compared to Trump, but
My opinion changed.
he supported background checks. He supported an extension of the assault weapons ban.
The NRA is an arm of the gun manufacturers, not gun owners. Yeah. Smith and Wesson and people like that are the people that keep
if there's
NRA
any
going.
hope, their power seems to be waning. But I think it's important to recognize that people from the Republican side of the aisle can come to the right conclusions, that there is hope that some of them will come around and be on the right side of history. It doesn't seem hopeful all the time, but we do have to find a way to work through this because, first of all, is there a need to regulate the monopolistic tendencies of media? The fact that they're controlled by the wealthy people. I mean, that's the part that's consistent, right, Robert?
Yep.
The power is still controlled by the wealthy people. The media the messages you hear is controlled by the people that have the power and have the money. And is there a reason to have some regulations for how many TV stations you can own? Is there a reason to have some regulations on screening for Russian and Chinese propaganda coming out? A story that I remember from the G.W. Bush era is after 9/11, they really didn't like Saddam Hussein. They wanted to attack Iraq, even though it had nothing to do with 9/11. But what happened was they leaked information to a newspaper. I don't remember which one it was, that there was yellow cake uranium in Niger. They leaked it to the newspaper, then the newspaper published it, and then the next thing I knew, Dick Cheney's quoting that as a source for why they have to attack, even though the information was planted and then it was used, and then it became...
It was a very poor source, too. I can't remember what it was, but it was like kindergarten
But
fake.
those are the things that can happen where being skeptical about any source of news is just a healthy thing. And how do we... I'm not sure we're getting more stupid, but people are not well informed. And partially is I don't think they've
Stupid was a poor word.
They've learned the critical thinking necessary to sort through the information that's available and decide what is, and what maybe is lost is apparently with some of the Trump supporters is the ability to sort out the bull that is coming on a daily basis.
Okay, we're coming up on
Another text,
Do we have a
maybe?
text quickly?
Okay.
Okay, while
under the
operators are absorbing that text, I want to remind everybody this is a program anybody can participate in. KCIW.org. Just say, I want to be part of Curry Cafe.
Clearly, they'll let me here, so anybody can do this.
Here comes the
Okay,
text.
we have this text. Let's see.
Okay, here's a text that is not a question. It's a statement. Regulation of any kind takes an act of Congress, and nothing is getting through Congress these days. That's an observation.
That's true.
They love you.
Okay, we're down to about a minute and a half. If people have closing statements, or
I just want to say
maybe we're out of statements. We've been making a lot of
encourage people, anybody that's listening, which you already are doing, is support community radio as an independent source of information, another source of information, as I've mentioned before. Listen to multiple sources. And this, before I was invited to do this, I didn't even realize I listened to this station because it's a good station when I'm traveling through, and I get this in Crescent City. Good music, good programming. Thank you for doing this.
Awesome.
And if you want to refer to somebody to this program, or if you want to listen to it again, or you missed parts of it, go to kcrw.org and you can find our replay there.
I have one thing I want to mention is creating one's own platforms for communication are helpful. On the St. Tim's stuff here in Brookings, I put up on Robert H. O'Sullivan on YouTube and have videos of things that people should be getting from other sources but aren't, and that's the way to share too.
Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Kevin.